The remote cabin stood at the very edge of an ancient, old-growth forest, serving as a silent witness to centuries of natural decay and relentless, unyielding growth. Elias, an artist desperately seeking solitude to break an agonizing and severe creative block, had rented the decrepit place for the entirety of the long, harsh winter. He wanted absolute isolation, and the deep, dark woods offered a profound, almost oppressive silence that seemed unnervingly expectant. Every creak of the floorboards and whistle of the wind through the eaves felt amplified in the suffocating quiet. It began on a freezing Tuesday morning, 3 weeks into his solitary retreat, with the artifact. Elias had been out foraging for firewood when he found it, half buried near the rotting roots of a colossal, dying oak directly behind the cabin. It was an irregular, blackened piece of wood, strangely smooth to the touch, almost like polished bone. But unlike bone, it was covered in bizarre, organic grooves that resembled intricate, pulsating veins far more than they resembled natural wood grain. Curiosity overcoming his initial unease, he brushed the frozen earth from its surface and brought it inside, placing it carefully on his cluttered work desk, intending to sketch it later that evening. The wood felt unnaturally warm against his skin, humming with a low, imperceptible vibration that seemed to subtly synchronize with the frantic beating of his own pulse. The first symptom was utterly mundane, an innocent, albeit persistent, itch on his left forearm. Elias scratched it absent-mindedly as he sat staring at the artifact, the charcoal in his right hand remaining completely untouched. The itch, however, grew rapidly in intensity, evolving from a minor annoyance into a deep-seated, burning irritation situated just beneath the surface of his skin. When he finally rolled up his thick flannel sleeve to inspect the area, he noticed a small, hardened patch of skin. It was an unnatural, sickly gray hue and rough to the touch. Frowning, he applied a thick layer of heavy-duty hand lotion, easily dismissing the abnormality as merely the biting, dry winter air taking its inevitable toll on his unaccustomed flesh. But the patch didn't fade with time. Instead, it began to spread with alarming speed. By the dawn of the third day, the gray, hardened skin had crept steadily up his forearm, reaching just past his elbow. It no longer looked anything like dry, chapped skin. It looked remarkably, terrifyingly like tree bark. It was coarse, rigid, and deeply fissured, mimicking the rough exterior of the very oak tree where he had found the artifact. When he nervously tapped the affected area with his fingernail, it didn't yield like flesh. Instead, it made a hollow, resonant, distinctly wooden sound. A cold, heavy dread settled deep in the pit of his stomach. The isolation he had so desperately sought now rapidly transformed into an inescapable trap. The snow outside was several feet thick and continuing to fall. The winding dirt roads were completely impassable, and his ancient, rust-eaten truck wouldn't even turn over when he desperately tried the ignition. Elias tried in vain to ignore the horrifying reality of his situation, burying himself completely in his work in a frantic attempt at distraction. He began to sketch the artifact compulsively, working for hours on end without stopping for food or rest. His lines, usually precise and deliberate, grew increasingly frantic, jagged, and chaotic. The interior of the cabin, once a cozy haven from the elements, now felt intensely claustrophobic and threatening. The air inside grew incredibly thick and difficult to breathe, smelling overpoweringly of damp, freshly turned earth, ancient mold, and rotting vegetation. The wooden walls of the cabin seemed to actively press inward, the dark knots in the pine floorboards seemingly watching his every move like a multitude of blind, dead, unblinking eyes. The unnatural transformation rapidly accelerated as the days bled into one another. The coarse, bark-like growth ruthlessly consumed his entire left arm, rendering the limb completely stiff, heavy, and entirely useless. He watched in horrified, paralyzed fascination as his fingernails steadily darkened to a deep, rotted brown, thickening and warping into hard, blunt, woody nubs. The pain was now a constant, inescapable companion, a deep, agonizing, gnawing ache that felt exactly as if his very bones were being violently warped, splintered, and twisted from the inside out. In a fit of sheer, unadulterated terror, he grabbed a sharp kitchen knife and attempted to forcefully cut the encroaching growth away. However, the steel blade simply snapped against the hardened, impenetrable surface of his arm, drawing not blood, but a thick, viscous, amber-colored sap-like substance that smelled strongly of pine and decay. The dark artifact resting silently on the desk seemed to actively observe his suffering. Its heavily veined surface appeared to pulse with a sickly, rhythmic light, perfectly in time with the violent, throbbing agony radiating throughout his ruined arm. Elias realized, with a wave of sickening, absolute clarity, that the piece of wood wasn't just an inanimate object. It was a seed, a malevolent, ancient curse that had been planted directly within his body, the very moment his bare skin had made contact with it. It was systematically reclaiming him, tearing down his human biology and forcefully reshaping him to flawlessly fit its own ancient, grotesque, and terrifying design. His right leg was the next to succumb to the horrific affliction, beginning to painfully stiffen and harden just hours after his left arm had fully transformed. He was reduced to dragging his ruined body across the dusty cabin floor, the sickening, rhythmic sound of his heavy, wooden limb scraping loudly against the rough floorboards, echoing loudly in the stifling, oppressive silence of the room. The cloying, sweet smell of pervasive rot and damp earth grew so overwhelmingly strong that it made him gag repeatedly. Struggling to pull himself upright, he caught a fleeting, devastating glimpse of himself in the cracked, grime-covered mirror hanging precariously above the small bathroom sink. The reflection staring back at him was a nightmare made flesh. The creeping gray bark had now spread aggressively up his neck, its rough edges creeping relentlessly towards his jawline and throat. His soft human skin was actively flaking and peeling away in large, dead patches, only to be instantly replaced by the rigid, deeply fissured, impenetrable crust. His left eye was nearly completely swollen shut, the delicate skin surrounding it hardening into a massive, coarse, misshapen woody knot that pulsed with a dull, persistent ache. Sheer, unadulterated madness began to aggressively gnaw at the fraying edges of his rapidly deteriorating mind. He could clearly hear hushed, overlapping whispers echoing in the continuous creaking of the cabin's aging timbers. It was a terrifying chorus of unseen voices speaking in an ancient, guttural language that sounded exactly like the violent rustling of dead autumn leaves caught in a brutal storm. They were welcoming him, their tones mocking yet inviting, urging him to finally surrender to the inevitable embrace of the damp earth, to willingly become a permanent part of the ancient, decaying, monstrous heart of the surrounding forest. He opened his mouth to scream, a desperate primal urge to voice his absolute terror, but the sound that eventually emerged from his ruined throat was nothing more than a dry, rasping, hollow croak, exactly like the sound of heavy branches forcefully scraping together in the midst of a violent gale. His vocal cords, too, were rapidly stiffening, calcifying, and turning to solid wood. He collapsed heavily onto the cold floorboards, his remaining muscles entirely unable to support his rapidly changing, increasingly heavy weight. His own body was no longer a sanctuary. It was a brutal, bloody battleground where fragile human flesh was rapidly and decisively losing a one-sided war against the aggressive, encroaching, unnatural flora. In a final, spectacularly desperate act born of sheer terror and agonizing pain, Elias began to drag his rapidly stiffening body towards the large iron wood stove situated in the center of the room. He dragged his heavy, unyielding, wooden limbs inch by agonizing inch across the floor. A frantic, singular thought consumed his fading human consciousness. If he was literally turning into solid wood, perhaps the intense, purifying heat of the fire could forcefully cleanse him. Perhaps the flames could forcefully burn the ancient curse away before it entirely consumed his physical form and completely extinguished his terrified mind. Summoning the absolute last vestiges of his waning human strength, he managed to forcefully pry open the heavy iron door of the stove. The blistering, intense heat immediately hit his face, providing a stark, shocking contrast to the bone-chilling cold dread that completely filled his soul. But as he desperately reached out with his trembling, remaining human hand in a frantic attempt to firmly grasp a burning, glowing log, his fingers suddenly and violently stiffened in midair. He watched, completely helpless and paralyzed with sheer horror, as the relentless gray bark rapidly and violently encased his right arm. It moved with terrifying speed, instantly freezing his hand in an agonizing, outstretched, grotesque claw merely inches from the roaring flames. The agonizing transformation, long delayed but entirely inevitable, was finally complete. Elias could no longer move even a fraction of an inch. He could no longer speak, cry, or scream. He was now a permanent prisoner trapped eternally within a body that was completely, fundamentally no longer his own. He had become a grotesque, horrifying living statue composed entirely of warped human flesh and cursed, ancient wood. The absolute last physical sensation he felt before his terrified, screaming mind finally, mercifully succumbed to the deep, encroaching, eternal darkness was a profound horror. He could vividly feel the slow, inexorable, forceful spread of massive, thick wooden roots violently bursting forth from his toes. He felt them violently burrowing downward, easily shattering the thick pine floorboards and reaching deep, deep into the cold, damp, waiting earth far below the cabin. Meanwhile, across the room, the blackened artifact resting innocently on the desk began to hum once more. Its malevolent, ancient work here was completely done. It sat in the suffocating silence, waiting patiently for the inevitable arrival of the next unfortunate soul to stumble upon it in the remote, silent, unforgiving woods.